Greetings, fine people of the internet. My name is Rill. I am back to read the first full chapter of The Greedy Queen, Eating with Victoria by Dr. Annie Gray. So last time we did the introduction. Now we will do the first full chapter. It is significantly longer. I may break this into two pieces. I don't know exactly how that will go yet. We will see. The name of the chapter is Childhood, so this is going to cover not just her birth and early years, but also all of the crazy train wreck that went before, because again, we are transitioning from the Georgian period into the Victorian period, and the Georgian period was a steamy hot mess express, all kinds of wild and fun, so let's get into it. Victoria was born on the 24th of May, 1819 at Kensington Palace. Her father, the Duke of Kent, described her as being as plump as a partridge. He had earlier declared that he did not mind whether his child was a girl or a boy. In the race to produce an heir to the British throne, a healthy child was enough. The Duke was one of a ragtag set of brothers, the eldest of whom was at the time Prince Regent, but would soon be George IV. George had no living children. His only daughter, Charlotte, after whom the city of Charlotte in, I believe it's North Carolina, is named in the United States, the Queen City, that would be after her. Charlotte had died in childbirth 2 years before, and despite having been a womanizer in his youth with a marital history worthy of a soap opera, by 1819 he was single, obese, and uninterested in producing another child. His heir was another brother, Frederick, who had followed in his elder brother's footsteps and was estranged from his wife. Next in line was William, Duke of Clarence, none of whose 10 children were legitimate. In 1819, therefore, the Duke of Kent was 51 and had 2 childless older brothers. The likelihood that he would get to the throne was very low. The likelihood that his offspring would reign, on the other hand, was extremely high. The Georgians were a dynasty of contrast. George III had produced 13 children, but in 1817 his only grandchild died, leaving no one beyond the immediate generation to inherit the throne. This led to an undignified and excruciating scramble for the various brothers. There were 9 boys in total, to get married and have babies. Long-term mistresses were unceremoniously dumped, old scandals were dug out and circulated, and German-speaking princesses of any hue were scrapped over like valuable broodmares. They almost all had hideous reputations. Lord Melbourne captured the general opinion when he described them as wild beasts, making love wherever they went and then saying they were very, very sorry they couldn't marry. They were, as it was, quite invincible. Their excuse for not marrying was the Royal Marriage Act passed by George III in an effort to control his offspring's choices, but which backfired painfully for many of his children and those who had the misfortune to become romantically entangled with them. Thomas Creevey, a politician of the time, went further, calling them profligate and unpopular, and stating that they were the damnedest millstones about the necks of any government. Victoria's father, Edward, was characteristically impecunious. His debts were huge, and he was unemployed, having been effectively removed from his position in the army after his troops mutinied and plotted to kill him. I wonder why he was unemployed. He had imposed harsh discipline on his men, but he also believed in self-discipline and prided himself on his upright habits and on having the constitution of an ox. That self-discipline didn't, however, extend to his lifestyle. He married his own German broodmare in 1818, settling on the widowed Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, proven to be fertile by the 2 children from her previous marriage. When she became pregnant with his child, he declared his intention to move back to England from Germany, where he'd been staying away from the critical British press, to ensure that the child was born on British soil. The regent refused to pay for the trip, but after hasty borrowings and wheedlings, the Duke raised enough money to come back. Wending its slow way from Leiningen to London came a bizarre circus of carriages and people. There were 7 vehicles containing the Duke, Duchess, the Duchess's daughter by her first marriage, maidservants, manservants, a governess, 2 doctors, several dogs, and bird cages. Imagine that cacophony. There were also 2 cooks and a man called Thomas Kingsthorne, whose role was to guard the Duke's silver, which traveled in its own caravan. I wish I knew what she meant by caravan. I'm assuming that's multiple vehicles, because that's usually what a caravan means, so I don't know if that was entirely separate from the Duke's procession itself. Either way, it strikes me as interesting that he had no money to move, but he had an entire caravan for his valuable silver. Sell the silver, dude, come on. They arrived at Kensington Palace a month before Victoria was born, which means Victoria's poor mother was pregnant, heavily pregnant, going over how many miles of awful roads, and then you get to the edge of land and you need to get to England, so now you're going to have to get on a ship and be seasick and all of I cannot even. No, that poor woman. And I don't like her. She's not a very likable individual, but no, that's just a terror of its own particular stripe. They arrived at Kensington Palace a month before Victoria was born. There are no surviving records to show exactly what the wary staff made of their new home. It was infested with black beetles and hardly the kind of royal palace they would have been used to back in Germany. Kensington had been built for William and Mary in the late 17th century and was site of many a basic fish dinner for that fairly private and down-to-earth royal couple. But in the 1810s, it had become a sort of repository for unwanted royals living cheek by jowl in apartments carved out of the former staterooms and courtiers' accommodation. Sounds like a really great place for Prince Andrew. Just a hint, Charles. Anyway, Victoria later recalled the constant ticking of the clocks belonging to another of the royal brothers, and the whole place must have had a rather forlorn feeling to it, a sad decline from its heyday as a Baroque country retreat. The couple didn't stay there long. The state of the apartments was such that, despite spending a fair amount of money he didn't have doing them up, the Duke decided to decamp to the country where it would be cheaper, and he could avoid the rest of the family. Seems like a thing you might want to do. The baby Victoria was the subject of intense press interest. While her father and his siblings were widely regarded as a waste of space, she was an innocent and finally a potential decent heir to the throne. Excluding the late Princess Charlotte, Victoria was the first of a new generation and could yet save the country from a whole line of dissolute old men, some of whom were even worse than those who had already reached the throne. Of course, nothing was guaranteed. Immediately after the Duke of Kent in the line of succession was the Duke of Clarence, who had rushed off and married his own German of childbearing age, Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meningen. She could well have children. Still, the press was thrown into a flurry, and right from her birth, newspapers reported on Victoria with the almost proprietary interest in her life that was to characterize her whole reign. 2 days after Victoria's birth, the Times Daily Bulletin read, "The Duchess of Kent, we are happy to say, continues as well as can be expected in every respect. Her Royal Highness intends suckling the infant princess." Breastfeeding, especially breastfeeding one's own child, was still enough of an oddity in early 19th century to incite interest. The Duchess of Kent was an experienced mother and clearly well versed in the latest thinking on feeding young babies. The value of breast milk had been recognized by the 18th century, and although children continued to be fed on animal milk or that 17th century staple papan pinata, pronunciation, I don't know, bread, which is breadcrumbs soaked in stock, milk, or wine and often flavored with sugar or spice, right up to the time of Victoria's birth, most babies were fed breast milk. That papan pinata stuff, breadcrumbs soaked in wine, must have been a big old party in that nursery. No wonder these brothers that were raised on that stuff were all over the place, to say the least. It just wasn't necessary that of their mothers who, if upper class, employed wet nurses instead. Over the next half-century, attitudes would change, influenced by concern over the habits and morality of wet nurses and the idea that bad habits could be passed from nurse to baby along with the milk. But in 1819, this was not the case, and the Duchess's choice shocked the upper-class circle around her. She wrote to her own mother, "I am so very happy that I can breastfeed her so well. I would have been desperate to see my little darling on someone else's breast. Everybody is most astonished that I am breastfeeding. People of the mundane world are really very unhappy. How much genuine joie de vivre do they miss?" The princess was also vaccinated against something which was in its infancy at the time but would later be talked of with approval by the then queen's early biographers. Children in the late Georgian period were weaned at anything between 6 and 18 months old, depending on the wealth of the family. For working-class families, the sooner a child could be fed on similar foods to the rest of the family, the better, but weaning could cause issues. The norm was to introduce foods such as beef tea, animal milk, broth, minced chicken, and bread pudding, along with rusks and other biscuits. It was kind of like a cookie. The poor couldn't afford most of these, and what they could afford would often have been adulterated, so infant mortality remained extremely high. Even among the upper classes, it was relatively common. William, Duke of Clarence's wife Adelaide, as well as suffering miscarriages and a stillbirth, poor woman, saw her only 2 surviving children die in their first few months. This was not the case for Victoria. Her mother commented on how large her appetite was as a baby, and when she was weaned at around 6 months old, the Duke of Kent wrote that she did not appear to thrive the less for the change. For the whole Kent family, however, life was about to be thrown into turmoil. The move to the country took place on Christmas Day, 1819. On the 28th, the princess was nearly injured by birdshot as a local boy out hunting missed his mark, but by mid-January, local color was the least of their worries. Why in the world was she in the range of a little boy with a gun? What is that about? The Duke, so proud of his indefatigable constitution, had caught and ignored a cold. It rapidly worsened, and, as was the usual way in the Georgian period, the doctors brought in alternately bled, cupped, and applied leeches to their patient. Their tortures were in vain. On the evening of 19th of January, the Duke was seen to weep at the thought of yet more bleeding. Who wouldn't? Ugh. By the 23rd, he was dead. That poor man. On the 29th, George III finally died as well, making George IV no longer the regent, but the king. Victoria and her mother were left stranded in Sidmouth with nothing apart from the Duke of Kent's debts. Fortunately for the twice-widowed Duchess of Kent, her brother was already in England and in possession of a large government pension. In keeping with the excitingly incestuous ways of 18th century European courts, he was the widower of Princess Charlotte, the daughter of George IV, whose death in childbirth had provoked that mad fraternal scramble to get married and procreate. Prince Leopold was one of the better of Victoria's fairly hideous cast of relatives, though he had his moments. She grew up to be very close to him, and he supported her through some of the uglier moments of her childhood, although the relationship became distant when, as queen, she took decision-making into her own very ready hands. Leopold moved the whole family back to drafty Kensington and supported them financially. The household became significantly smaller, although the Duchess seems to have retained the services of the cook, Charles Leglightner, a clear declaration of her desired status, as male cooks were expensive and tended to come with hefty demands for modern kitchens and a wide range of equipment. At Kensington Palace, the Kents occupied the apartments allocated to the Duke in 1798, spread over 2 floors at the southeast corner. The Duke had done a bit of work to them before he moved to Germany to get married, but they were still fairly basic by aristocratic standards. The palace itself was in a general state of decay, with bulging walls held up by props and iron bands, dry rot endemic, and damp making many of their rooms uninhabitable. Cooking and service areas had been shoehorned in during the conversion of the palace to apartments, and often involved waiting staff scuttling between outdoor buildings to the main palace with no protection from the elements for them or the food they were carrying. The apartments were flanked by those of other spare royals, including the Duke of Kent's slightly disgraced sister, Princess Sophia. I'd love to know, the delineation between slightly disgraced and proper disgraced, but we don't go into that, unfortunately. She quickly became a close confidant of the Duchess, who spoke very limited English and was quite isolated. Throughout Victoria's childhood, she was a staple fixture, often dining with the Duchess or dropping in after dinner. Victoria's closest relationship during her childhood, especially after the marriage and subsequent departure of her much-beloved half-sister Feodora when Victoria was 9, was with her governess, Louise Lazen, later Baroness Lazen, who was reputed to like eating only potatoes and chewed caraway seeds to alleviate bad breath. This wasn't uncommon, and caraway comfits were widely available for that very reason. In many respects, this early part of Victoria's life wasn't drastically different to that of many aristocratic children. She was closer to her governess than her mother. She dined separately on nursery food, and her main companion was a relative, Feodora, of similar rank. Despite her probable future as the most powerful person in Britain, she played with toys designed to inculcate standard female behaviors. She had a doll's house, where she could practice the required conventions of aristocratic girls. It still survives at Kensington Palace and is typical of the toys deemed suitable for upper-class girls. It consists of a drawing room set up for taking tea, and a kitchen complete with mini charcoal stoves and a dresser laden with plates. Adelaide, Duchess of Clarence, gave her a child's tea set, which again was a fairly standard girl's plaything. Tea was intrinsically linked to femininity, and a woman at her tea things epitomized gentility and delicacy for many 19th century writers. Victoria may have been set to be queen, but she still had to adhere to the expected norms of feminine behavior, among which skilled teapot manipulation was surprisingly telling. Of course, things weren't entirely as they were for others. All of this apparent normality was underlain with tensions as to her future, and while it seemed that Victoria remained unaware of her status, she was clearly used to being fawned upon and making demands, even when very young. She was at that point third in line to the throne and not tainted by being an adult male Georgian. The public interest in her hadn't waned, and staged appearances helped to whet the appetites of those who glimpsed her. Later biographies, written while Victoria was on the throne, dwelt on the romantic aspect of her childhood in a tumble-down palace behind wrought iron gates. She was seen as a young child to take breakfast with her mother on the Kensington Palace lawn, attended by a single page. She rode a donkey around the grounds. She watered her feet instead of the flowers. She got stuck in apple trees and fell down scree slopes. All of these carefully culled anecdotes belie the fact that, as emerged later in Victoria's own writings and those of the people around her, by the time she was a teenager, a system had been put in place which was very far from carefree and innocent. The Kensington system, as it became known, aimed to isolate the princess, to ensure that she only socialized with a very select group chosen by her mother and her mother's closest companion, John Conroy. They hated Mr. Conroy. Conroy was, like the Duke of Kent, an unsuccessful soldier. Oh, Victoria's mother had a type, obviously. He had entered the Kent household before the Duke's death, and by the mid-1820s, the widowed Duchess was completely reliant upon him. She had previous form in relying on strong but not altogether disinterested men, having formed a similarly close relationship with a male advisor in Germany after the death of her first husband. The two were tied together by self-interest and the awareness that, in Victoria, they had a tool that could ensure their success in the murky world of court and government politics if only it could be handled right. They failed, but their attempts to shape Victoria into their creature were extremely painful and at times downright cruel. In later life, when Victoria looked back on her childhood, her reminiscences were colored by her experiences as a teenager after Feodora had left and the system tightened its grip. She recalled that we lived in a very simple, plain manner. Breakfast was at 8:30, luncheon at 1:30, dinner at 7, to which I came generally, when it was no regular large dinner party, eating my bread and milk out of a small silver basin. Tea was only allowed as a great treat in later years. That meal pattern, with those timings, was one she largely stuck to throughout her childhood. She also continued to eat very plain food. This was partly cultural. Notions that a child's behavior would be directly affected for the worse by strong flavors persisted well into the 19th century, especially for girls. Food science was in its infancy, but in general, the concept that foods could be divided into groups, including the evocatively named flesh formers, and allocated according to gender, level of exercise, age, and class, was well established. Likewise, the physical results of certain diets were pored over. Unsurprisingly, flatulence in particular tended to be noted as an undesirable trait in upper-class children. However, then as now, cultural ideas about foods played a large role in determining what was thought to be a good diet. Meat was regarded as the mainstay of a healthy regime, especially mutton, along with eggs and vegetables. Sweet foods were reserved for bribery and treats. However, the Duchess and Conroy seem to have taken this to extremes. Victoria ate like a child, kept to the nursery, and fed the most basic of meals for much longer than most of her class. Even after the age of 13, when children would generally emerge from the nursery and dine with their parents, many of her meals were still taken in her room. 13's kind of old to still be stuck in a nursery. Anyway, yeah, of course she was miserable. Who wouldn't be? By the age of 11, Uncle Leopold was worrying about the effect on her nerves. I hear that you do not like overmuch to take exercise. Listen to my advice, dearest love, and force yourself. Though it may be a little tiresome, your health and state of nerves require a great deal of air and exercise, and if you neglect it, you will materially suffer from it. And it's very clear that she developed a habit of eating too much and very fast whenever she got the opportunity. If I was to give you an opinion, I should say that a certain little princess eats frequently, a little too much, and almost always a little too fast. Eating too fast is particularly unwholesome and should therefore be avoided as much as possible because it lays the foundation of many a disease. The regular large dinner parties Victoria refers to were another feature of life at Kensington. From at least 1828, the Duchess began hosting dinners intended to impress and woo the assorted movers and shakers around the court. George IV was proving implacable on the subject of money, titles, status, and all the other things that the Duchess and Conroy thought should be their due. With an eye to the future, when George would be no more, it was important to assemble a support network. If in the years ahead battle lines should be drawn up between the king and his eventual heir, the Duchess wanted to have as many people on her side as possible. After all, the Georgian monarchs had a well-established history of family rifts between monarchs and their heirs, so it wasn't as if she was doing anything radical or controversial. The dinners held by the Duchess were glittering affairs. The kitchen was very well equipped, although badly set up, and the Duchess repeatedly applied for money to make alterations. In the 1830s, she finally succeeded in getting a new state-of-the-art kitchen with cast iron ovens, a running supply of hot water, and hot closets to keep food warm. But before this, her staff were working in a space largely unchanged from the days of William and Mary and hopelessly out of date for the early 19th century. However, it was supplemented by a confectionery and a still room, the housekeeper's domain used for making jams and preserves, as well as distillations both for pleasurable and medicinal consumption. And there would have been no real limit to what could have been cooked there. The kitchen inventory for the Kent's apartments included ice cream making equipment, cake molds, jelly molds, and pastry pans. The Duchess continued to employ a man as her head cook, and he would have been expected to produce meals to rival anything turned out by her aristocratic guests. The dishes would have been French influenced with complex flavors and a wide range of ingredients. Victoria would not, at this stage, have experienced all of those possibilities, however. She was not invited to the large dinners, merely paraded through the room before dinner and again after. Guests needed to be reminded of the reason they should support the Duchess, but that did not necessitate Victoria actually being present. Doesn't the Duchess just sound charming? That's about halfway through the chapter. I'm going to leave it there, but I will catch up very soon on the rest. And then we get a little bit deeper after this into descriptions of the kitchen and the travels and travails that the Duchess dragged little Victoria on, and little Victoria fighting as teenagers do against, all of the things that she doesn't want to do, understandably, in this particular case. But it is just a really interesting way that she was raised, and certainly the Duchess and John Conroy in many ways did not have her best interest at heart, so it will be fun to go through all of that with you. I do look forward to it. Please leave any comments on any content, anything that you'd like to maybe see some of in the future, any contributions of interesting information regarding any of this. Like from the last video, I know I asked if anybody knew how one would validate the provenance and authenticity of any of Queen Victoria's large underwear. So it's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you very shortly. Bye.